Hey everybody, it is Dean Z, and I am doing an application read from a completely new venue here at the law school instead of in my usual reading chair. This, I think, is going to be a fun one. Now, I can't help but notice over the years that you all really like it when I rip someone apart. You like that best. And this is not going to be that kind of application read. This is a very good application. But it's got a little bit of a twist in it because it's a current student who volunteered to let me use his app. And he and I actually met earlier today and went over it, line by line. And so I have all this sort of background information informing me now that I wouldn't have just from the four corners of the application. So I think that's going to make it fun for you to listen. It shows sort of the both what's really good about what we do, but also sort of the limits of the application process. So I hope you'll find it as interesting as I did having this conversation. I will say before we get any further, I feel a lot like I'm in a video deposition right now. This is exactly how I would sit if you were deposing me. I'd be sitting up straight with my arms like this. Anyway, let's get started, shall we? All right, so this applicant is someone who has actually just graduated from the University of Michigan. So this means they were applying in 21-22, that admissions season. And he told me that he submitted his Michigan application last because he wanted it to be perfect. And so I think he told me he applied, I know it was December, I think he said mid-December. That could be wrong, but it was definitely sometime in December that he applied, because I know you all like to know that too. All right, so as always, the first part is just the application that the applicant has filled out, get a little bit of quick flavor for how things are going. I can see that he was born in the Midwest, that he currently is living on the East Coast, and at the time of his application, and that his hometown is in Alaska, which is unusual, but neither here nor there. I just caught my eye. But one thing that is about all those different places, this tells me that this is someone who is very comfortable moving around. This isn't someone who has been planted in one spot and bloomed there and never moved, right? So I always like to see that because as a practical matter, most people who are applying to Michigan aren't Michiganders, aren't people who have even ever been to Michigan or certainly aren't very familiar with it. So I know that in order to lure someone to Michigan, it has to be someone who's sort of open to the idea of relocating. And that can be signaled in a lot of different ways, but knowing that this person has already been living in a number of different locales tells me, okay, this person is certainly open to moving around. So I'm looking here at the part of the application that says how many times you've taken the test, and I see that they've taken it 4 times. It's not my absolute favorite, so we'll return to that, just noting that for now. Also, I can tell you that they're fluent in French, and they also speak a little bit of Cantonese, and he said it was just enough to talk to grandma, which I thought was adorable. Everyone should be able to talk to their grandmother, right? And then it also has information about his parents. They both have professional degrees, so they are not in the first generation of their family to go to college. Now I'm looking at their educational info, just flipping through this. I can tell you they went to a very fine undergraduate institution on the East Coast. And okay. I'm also looking at the section about high school here, where they went to high school. I mentioned in Alaska. I know from my conversation that they were in Alaska because their father had a military posting there, and he happened to have gone to a high school that was almost about half the people were the children of military service members. Okay. All right, so now I'm looking at his resume. The resume is 2 pages, which, as you know from past episodes, is totally fine. Although when we were going over it in my office, he said, I've just had a 1-page resume for all of law school now, and I'm sort of horrified by how long this is. But he actually did, I think, an extremely good job of packing in a lot of information to the 2 pages. So it doesn't feel like, sometimes you see a 2-page resume that you feel like someone, for random reasons, was just trying to expand it to get to 2 pages. There's a lot of good information in here. This is not fluff, and yet it is it's tight, right? It's very, he's making efficient use of the space. So as I mentioned, went to a very fine undergrad institution, majored in public health and French. I said something when we were talking about public health. It's a great major, very challenging, and you're probably very good with data, very quantitative. And he said, with great enthusiasm, I love biostats. So that was cute. Okay, so I know that he wrote a thesis in French. He specified, and I think this was smart, said senior thesis written in French, in parentheses. I thought that was a good detail to include because I would not ever assume that someone had written something in French, even if it was a French thesis. And so that's impressive, right, to write it in a second language. So that's the kind of detail, very small amount of information, but, catches my attention. And also mentions that they had a separate independent research project funded by the undergrad institution, which he did in the summer during college, again in France. So that's impressive. But at the time of applying, he had been working. He'd graduated 2 years before applying, or almost 3 years before applying, and had gone to work immediately after graduation for a consultant, one of the well-known consulting companies. And so consulting company names are, sometimes they say blah, blah, blah consulting, but sometimes it's just a string of names. This is one that's just a string of names. It's quite famous, so I'm completely familiar with it. But it's something to think about because many consulting companies are not that famous, right? They're smaller and you might not know of them. At no point in his description of his job does he say, this is a consulting agency. He says his title has the word consultant in it, so that's a clue. But I guess this is just to emphasize my constant theme that in a resume, you need to be making sure everything is clear to people who know nothing about you or the field that you are in. So if you're working for a company, it's great if you can say in one line, one sentence, something describing what it is that company does. As I say, this was not actually a concern in this instance because it's a company that I knew. But to describe sort of what his work is, he also lists the major clients that he has worked for, that he was working for at this institution, and he names some of his clients. And so I can see through that he is working for lots of global health related clients. So he is using that part of his undergraduate degree clearly from his work. And this is not necessary, but someone who pursues a topic quite deeply, that is interesting, right? That's not typical. Many people bounce around and that's completely fine. But when someone has found something that they're very interested in, pursued it through college, and then pursued it afterwards, that's making a strong and positive impression on me about sort of their seriousness of purpose and their interest. And of course, public health is related to the law in the form of health law. So we'll get to that too in a little bit, but I'm thinking, all right, I'm kind of seeing how someone who is doing what he is doing is interested in applying to law school. Before I've read a word of any of his essays, I'm already getting that impression. He also talks about work. He has this divided up into education and then professional experience. So he's talking underneath his full-time job. He talks about work that he did in undergrad, like research assistant type work, that kinds of things. And he specifies how many hours per week he had these jobs, these campus jobs. In our talking about it, he mentioned that in the summer he actually was doing those jobs full time, which is information he didn't include here, and that's perfectly appropriate. That did not cause me did not raise any questions. He could have specified it, and I think if he did it sort of as efficiently and clearly as he did everything else, that would have been good. But it's always a balance when you're in a resume of providing enough information versus providing too much information. If you have too much detail, it gets overwhelming for the reader. So that's always a balance. I know that can be, what I've just said can be frustrating. It's like, well, I want clear advice about exactly what I should and shouldn't say. But it will be different for each candidate. It just depends on how much you have to tell me. Just be cautious and mindful about not over detailing every single thing you did. I feel like he hit it right on the nose with what he presented. His next section of his resume is community involvement, and there really isn't. He mentions a thing he did as part of his employment, sort of an employee resource group for people who are Asian American, which is his ethnic identity, and so it's like a few hours a week for his company, but there's nothing, so it's not really community involvement, honestly. It's like part of his, it's not outside his work, I'll say that. So he hasn't really done anything since graduating that could count as community involvement. So that's something that I would pick up on. However, I will say he did so much in undergrad that that's not a red flag in any possible way. So he goes on to list all of that. He, mentions, basically, he did a lot of student government work in undergrad, and he was president of the student body. I don't see a ton of presidents of the student body, and I'm always cautious about when I'm doing these to say something is really impressive, lest everybody thinks, oh, I guess I have to be president of the student body in order to get into law school. Not the message I'm giving here, but I will say it is extremely impressive, and so that definitely jumps out to the reader. And he had many other roles. He didn't start out as president of the student body. He started out in smaller roles and then worked his way up to president. So that, again, that shows commitment. That shows sort of some prolonged involvement, which is a positive impression for the reader. And he did many other things too that I won't go into in too much detail, although we talked about how one of the things that he lists, it was an undergraduate activity, and he gave the formal name of it, and it was like something on inclusive excellence, and it's a name that would make sense if you knew the institution. I'm sure everybody who is there knows the name, but as an outsider, it's a little confusing. So this is, it might have been better if he'd just said, the Committee on Inclusive Excellence or something, maybe been slightly less precise, slightly less detailed, but then perhaps more clarity. So that's one of those lessons of like more and less. Sometimes more information ends up obscuring your message. It's a very minor point, though. Anyway, lots of other things, not just student government, was involved in, he was on a mental health task force, he was in a language club, things like that, doing, lots of different interests, all of which, are very clearly laid out here. Okay. He also mentions at the end like some writing and speaking engagements that he had, one of which was as a panelist for his undergraduate alma mater a couple years after he graduated. I think that's impressive. It's like they remember you, they ask you to come back. That is a sign that, everybody at that institution, you left that institution in very good standing. And particularly when you're the student body president, that's not always easy to do, right? Part of your job is to sort of challenge the administration to some degree, right? So that note really impressed me too. And finally, at the very end, we have my favorite section of skills and hobbies and languages. Now, he lists that he's a native English speaker. Not necessary to do. Would have been not a problem. I mean, it's not like I was horrified by this or anything, but just don't, I'm assuming that you're a native English speaker. If you're not a native English speaker, that is worth specifying for sure, because then it's impressive that you are fluent in English, that it's, a second language, but, and you should say whatever your native language is. But if English is your native language, you should know that is my assumption and you don't need to specify it. Also mentioned some of his technical skills. Some of them are sort of data skills, like Stata and that sort of thing, Python. And then some of them are other kinds of like web design, things that don't really have anything to do with law school. So I think it's fine that he included those, but the part that I was most interested in was the skills that were translatable to a future legal career. And then finally, he did a great job on his hobbies. He clearly had been watching some A2Z, like the episode I did on how to do your interest section. So he lists 3 things that are, he doesn't say cooking, writing, and exercise. He says Nordic cross-country skiing, writing short science fiction, and cooking fusion cuisine. Loved it. Perfect. That was no notes. Yeah, so well done for that. Okay, now the essays. All right, so first we have personal statement. And the first sentence just immediately captures one's attention. It says, when I was 9, I attended my first funeral. You immediately want to know, where is this going? I will say that, I think I've mentioned this in past episodes, that I have a slight aversion or concern when people focus too much on childhood. So when I was 9 might have raised my antenna a little bit, like, where are we going with this? But that is not the theme. It is not an essay about that funeral when he was 9. It was an essay about, like, it's just really perfectly done. He's setting up the context without dwelling on his childhood, right? So he says he went to this funeral, and he was, heard all about how this person had died, and it inspired him. It made him think, I need to be a doctor, and I need to help people, so that they are not dying in painful ways. Very sweet 9-year-old, right? But then he goes right into college, and he talks about a seminar he took on bioethics in college, where he is pre-med at this point, right? And he, sorry, I'm trying to read my own handwriting here. Let's see what did I write here? Okay, no, it's just little things. He told me that this was a seminar in his junior year, for example. But he talks about the cases that they read, legal cases, and how he started thinking about the legal aspect to healthcare access, and how that was perhaps more interesting to him than just being a straight-up doctor. And he makes a lovely analogy to case law with it's too, I don't feel like I could explain this clearly without just reading the whole thing, which I don't want to do. But he makes an analogy, makes it a metaphor to something from growing up in Alaska, and it's very well done. So this is not like flowery kinds of language in any way. It's very straightforward and clear writing, but it is also using imagery in a way that is very effective. Okay, so he explains how he gets interested in this, and then he goes into government consulting, and then he moves and then he talks about how in consulting, when he's, as he starts his job as a consultant, COVID happens, right? And he is on a particular group that is cross-cultural, and he was working with a bunch of people who are French-speaking. So he manages to weave in information about his fluency in French, and how and this is my favorite part of all the essays, is he's talking about how he's clearly being very mindful about how to connect with people from France that he is working with, and how he can best use language in order to do that. And so he's like, on his way to and from work, he's listening to podcasts and stuff in French, so he can kind of bone up on the language and his informal, language choices. And it made me realize, reading this, like, what a really thoughtful community member this person is, right? Like, how much work he was putting into communicating in this one context. And it just really gives a very strong impression of what kind of community member he would be. And spoiler, now that I have known him for 3 years, it was absolutely accurate. So, and then, so he goes through all this, and then at the end he circles back to the funeral and talks about how he wants to use law to help people like this person whose funeral he first attended. And I mean, I feel like I've made it sound like it's meandering, but it's two extremely tight, well-crafted pages where he gets a lot of information in, and it all hangs together. It's not in any way jumpy. We're not going from topic to topic to topic. It is extremely well constructed. So I really liked that. Then he also wrote 2 optional essays. The first one he wrote was from our prompt, our fourth, we have 9 different prompts that you can answer. You can choose up to 2. So one that he chose, the first one he chose was describe a quality or skill you have and discuss how you expect it will help you in your legal career. Now, again, he starts with when I was a kid. So it's interesting, both 2 essays now have started when he was in childhood, but he does not dwell on that at all. And he starts with a very evocative, I'd say, little story about how he used to like to go grocery shopping, and his favorite part was checkout because he loved to meet the cashiers and introduce himself. Hi, I'm so-and-so, and I live here, and this is what I do. And his parents had to say, like, don't do that. We don't tell all strangers our phone numbers and addresses, but you can imagine how cute that might have been. Anyway, and again, knowing him, it sounds very on brand. And he talks about a love of getting to know people. So he's talking about all like basically his hobby is getting to know people and like different ways he has pursued that and how he thinks that's going to be very helpful to his legal career for both working with his colleagues and his clients. And this is right up my alley, this essay. Like, one of the things that I think is most important about our particular community is the community. And so people who delight in that and want to add to that and help build that's not going to be everybody at this law school, but having people who have that as their priority is something they really care about. That's incredibly important to carrying on our traditions. So this really leapt out at me. And finally, his last essay was our essay 7 prompt, which reads, how might your perspectives and experiences enrich the quality and breadth of the intellectual life of our community or enhance the legal profession? So this one is about all his various identities. So he is a queer man, Asian American, and also Catholic. And so, none of us is only one thing, right? So he takes all these different elements of his identity that are important to him and weaves them together into a really lovely story. However, it is very much focused on his youth and some of the challenges he had with all those identities in his youth. And so that is not, is something that's a little, it catches my attention, right? I'll put it that way. And he and I talked about it, and it was so interesting. He said, he was writing this during COVID. He was extremely isolated during that time, as many of us were, and it made him spend a lot of time looking backwards and thinking on his childhood. And he thinks that's why that came out so much in these essays. And I thought that was so interesting. And I am glad it did not, his focus on childhood in this did not in any way turn me off when I was reading the application, because it is, it was very well done, but also it's interesting that it's reflective of this one time in his life when he's applying to law school, like the circumstances surrounding him, which of course he didn't talk about in the essay because it didn't have anything to do with the essay. But it really reveals to me how, on the one hand, I feel like I'm getting a ton of information about this applicant from the materials he submitted, but then there's so much that I am not learning, right, that I can't learn from the application. And I'm constantly aware of this. We're so interested in knowing who are we admitting, what's their story, what are they going to be like here in law school. And the fact of the matter is, like, we have only ever limited information in front of us, and we draw certain conclusions from an imperfect amount of information. And sometimes I'm going to be drawing the wrong conclusion, or sometimes maybe it's the right conclusion, but it should have been overwhelmed by other, positive information. So, point is, you're doing your best when you're doing these applications, and you just have to have some faith that even if some reader doesn't love it, other readers will, if you are really doing a good job and correctly, you do the work to reflect on who you are and convey that clearly. So this essay, he starts, talking about conflict that he had, sort of between his father and he, different political views, different views. His father had strong views about what he wanted to see his son do with his career and in his life, and basically he went in a very different direction but he tells this, and he tells some stories about when he first started realizing in childhood that he had that he was bi, and kids would ask him about it, and he tells us in just like a really effective way. He doesn't tell the story like this is the worst thing that ever happened to anybody. He makes it clear that it was painful to him, but he clearly has a sense of perspective about it. He's not trying to make it more dramatic, more earth-shattering than it was, while still letting you see that this was a very powerful influence on him as a young person. And he just really threads that needle very nicely. He is sort of showing his thinking about how he has grappled with his identity without, and it just sounds very real, I guess I'd say. But as I say, also clearly reflecting a sense of perspective about what he went through. And it also shows that you don't have to have gone through something very dramatic to have an effect on the reader and have it be very compelling to a reader. And then he winds this all up by talking about how he has, learned over time the importance of standing with other people who may or may not share any of his identities, but helping to advocate for people who are in difficult positions. And this can be hard to say in a way that sounds sincere, but he did, and I think it is because he really was sincere. He wasn't telling a story that he thinks I wanted to hear. He was accurately portraying who he is. And also, I will note finally that he did not write an essay about why he wanted to go to Michigan in particular. And I know there is this sense out there that you have to write a why blank school essay in order to ever get in. And that is not correct. You absolutely don't, and he is a great example of this. But I will say that at the very end, he just has a couple of sentences that relate to the rest of his essay about what it is about Michigan that he thinks he will really thrive, why he will thrive here. And again, it shows he understands, he's done enough research to understand this school a bit, and he has done enough thinking about himself to understand himself quite a lot. And then finally, he has one addendum about the LSAT, and I feel like this will speak to many of you who have taken the LSAT. During the night before my first LSAT, a persistent car alarm on my street prevented me from sleeping. As a result, my first LSAT score is an outlier from my others. I can't tell you how many car alarms at night kept me from sleeping, LSAT addendums I have written, and every time I feel that pain. Like, how annoying. Why tonight? Why is this happening? Anyway, so it was a grand total of 3 sentences. Perfect. No notes. All right. Now we are at the part of the application that is the CAS report, the Credential Assembly Service report, which has your LSAT, your GPA, your transcript, and your letters of rec. Okay, I can see information here about the undergraduate institution. I can see that 28% of the people at this school score in the top 5% of the LSAT, and fewer than 5% are scoring in the bottom 20 percentile. Like, this is a school where people are good at taking tests. They're very academically able and prepared. So, he is performing, whatever his performance is, it is against a very strong cohort of nerds, shall we say. I say that with, obviously, a great deal of affection. Fellow nerd, right? Okay, and then I could see that he has a GPA of about 3.7. which is in the top, I'm going to say 1/3 of people from this institution who are applying to law school. So that is a very solid academic performance. And as I mentioned earlier, you may recall, I can see now that he has taken the LSAT 4 times. And I just wish he hadn't taken it that 4th time, because what it was is he took it one time, and it was not a weak score by any means, but he goes up a lot on the second time. You know, car alarm, right? No car alarm. And then the 3rd time he goes up, not as much, but still a fair amount, and now he has a very good score. And then he goes on to take it that 4th time, and I said, why? Why did you take it that 4th time? And he said that when he took it the second to last time, the penultimate time, when he was doing logic games, he got to the end of it and realized he had misdiagrammed the whole thing and, you know, messed it up. And he realizes that with 2 minutes left to go in the LSAT. So he thought, if I take it again, I won't make that mistake. And then I'll get, like, I don't know, an amazing, an even more amazing LSAT score. Plus, he thought, you know, getting a higher score would perhaps get him a little more scholarship money. These are all rational things, right? But what happened is he took it the 4th time and his score went down. Because once you get to a certain point, you are just as likely to go down as to go up. There is no statistically significant difference between these two scores. And so it's the kind of thing, obviously it did not doom him. But when I see 4 scores, it's a question that gets raised. It's like, what's happening here? Why did you take it so many times? And then 3 of these scores are really pretty close together, right? So what the heck? And then the 4th time it goes down. And so, like, what were you thinking? It just raises a question, and that is not really what you want to do in the reader's mind. You don't want to raise that question. So, but I'm not really going to criticize this, because I also understand the impulse to say, you know, I don't want to pull the plug. I think I have more in me than what this has showed. I'm so glad I wasn't just knee-jerk biased against that 4th score, because I'm very glad he came here. Okay, and next we see the LSAT writing sample, and I always look at this, but it's very quickly, right? So I've just finished telling you all about his essays, which were beautifully written, really effective. Like, a big part of what's making me like this candidate is both the content of his essays, but also his style of writing. So I want to look at this LSAT writing sample just to make sure it's consistent with that, and it is. It's you know, just glancing at it quickly, I can see he's using sentences of different lengths. I can see he is, you know, using lots of different kinds of punctuation. He is, you know, he's using a good vocabulary. He's not simply repeating the prompt. It is well done. So, and he finishes it. Sometimes people don't finish their writing samples, and that makes me think, that's funny. You wrote these great essays, and yet this fairly simple writing sample you didn't finish. Is that because you didn't feel like finishing it, or because you ran out of time, or whatever? But it does make me worry a smidge about, you know, your writing ability. Not a lot. Again, I hope you could see that even when I'm worried about something, I often will overlook it. Okay, now I'm looking at the transcripts, and so he has a couple of not beautiful scores here. He has a C- in one class, and a C in another, and a C in another. He's taking very hard science classes and calculus classes, and then they are alongside all these A+, like a shocking number of A+ and A's. And actually, in his last 2 years, he has nothing but A's and A+. So he switched in after his first year. He had originally come in as an engineering major, and then he switched to public health. And clearly, public health was much more his jam. Okay, now to wind up, we have the letters of rec. Wow, these are great letters. So we require 1 letter. We accept up to 4. We recommend mostly that people give 3. But he gave us 4, and they were all different enough that it made sense that he had 4. Now, 3 of these are professors, but they're from different disciplines. He was a double major, so that was easy for him to do. And then 1 is an employer. And I actually think, in a perfect world, you always will have a mix of academic and employers. Now, not everybody can do that. If you've graduated too long ago, getting an academic letter can be impossible. But if it's possible to have both of those, that's great because it's telling me different things. So the academic letters say things like, it starts out, I am thrilled. As someone who's written a lot of letters, I will tell you that when I start out, I am thrilled. I am truly thrilled. I don't say that easily. And it uses phrases like outstanding critical thinking skills. He had depth. He had surprised me with the depth of connections that I had not noticed. He worked incredibly hard. He will be a phenomenal student. He was head and shoulders above his peers. Yada yada yada. Another one here talks about how well he interacts with other students. So this is also an academic letter, but it's in a very different tone. It's also a big rave, but it's specifically talking about his social skills. Here's another academic letter that describes him as what teachers consider ideal. And it goes on to explain, I mean, no one's ever written a letter like that about me, so I'm a little sad. But yeah, very, very positive letter. And then finally, we have one from his work that talks about not just his quality of his work, but his involvement and his commitment to the community of the workplace. So, long story short, this guy got admitted, he came to Michigan, and now he has graduated. He's off to a spectacular career, and he has been an incredibly important part of our community. And I am thrilled that he chose Michigan. And and it was really fun to get to talk to someone about all the different choices they made, that I might just wonder about when I'm reading it and make my own conclusions, and now I get the real story. So I hope that was useful to you, and as you think about preparing your own application for this coming cycle. And thanks to Dustin for finding this room and for sitting with me for so long. And wherever you go, go blue.